Okay, so you answered this question about why the law might be different in Germany and America. Um, one reason is because Germany has this specific history with a connection between these symbols and actual physical mass harm against against a group of people. So the Jewish Holocaust was a result of mass racism, white supremacy that was encouraged by rhetoric and symbols like these. And so, because of that specific history, in Germany, they have made some of these symbols illegal because of that connection with actual harm that it contributed to. Now, some might argue that while we didn't have this sort of big, horrific event like the Holocaust, we certainly have a history of horrific violence against particular groups of people, and specifically African Americans, and specifically by groups like the KKK. So if you look at the horrors of slavery and what came after that in terms of mass lynching and Jim Crow, some would say like we have similar horrors. We may not have a name for it like the Holocaust, and maybe it wasn't concentrated in one specific period of time with the kind of numbers or concentrations that were there in the concentration camps. But certainly the scale of the horror and violence was just as much. And there were symbols that were associated with that, including these white supremacist symbols. To some people, the Confederate flag is symbolic of some of those horrors. And so while it's not illegal to fly the Confederate flag, you are now seeing that in some parts in the South, they're taking down Confederate symbols, Confederate statues, um, different things that symbolize that history that was certainly in some way centered around the subjugation of and violence against Black people. So it's interesting to see where this is going to go, but you know, these sorts of issues are evolving, and it's interesting to see the connections there. So, moving on to one other type of thing. So we have some laws that censor certain types of media, pictures, film, literature. That's one form of government limitation on our freedom or what we can do. And oftentimes, these things are limited because they cause great offense or general offense. And this is actually the second theory for how the government might be justified in limiting our freedom, our personal freedom. And it's called the offense principle. And I should mention that just because these are legal theories, it is not true that everyone agrees with the laws that fall under these different categories. So almost everyone will say, yes, the harm principle is a good reason to have a law, even though there's some difference of opinion about what actually constitutes harm. The rest of these, though, are pretty controversial, and we're learning them because there are laws that are based on all of these principles, but they're certainly not as universally accepted as the harm principle. So the offense principle essentially claims that the government is justified in regulating or prohibiting activities which cause severe offense to others. Again, the challenge is what constitutes severe offense. So, is it Nazi symbolism in Germany was considered to them offensive enough to be made illegal, but in other circumstances, what would be considered so offensive that we want to make it illegal? Again, we'll talk a little bit more about this specifically when we talk about freedom of expression. But since we are talking about these different theories, I wanted to mention it here as well. Okay, so the third theory is called legal paternalism. And if you think about the word paternal, when you think about that word, you would probably think of a parent, right? Someone being, or if you think of the word like paternity test, right, to figure out who the father is, or that person's being very paternal, meaning they're being fatherly, or maternal is being motherly. So it does have to do with parents, and it's sort of like when the government acts as a parent. So when a parent, a parent has a lot of sort of power over their child, limits what they can or can't do, and does limit the freedom of their child, right? So like my son would love to eat ice cream for breakfast every day. I limit that and I don't allow him to do that, or I limit his screen time, or whatever kind of rules or regulations I set on my kids. And as a parent, I don't do that because I don't want my kids to be free or to be able to make choices, but because I'm trying to raise them to be healthy and safe and develop healthy and safe habits. So, when we think about legal paternalism, you can think about it in that way, that the government is sort of acting as a parent for people. So, according to this view, the government should act as a parent in protecting us from ourselves. This includes the harm principle. So, in paternalism, definitely people should be stopped from hurting others, but it also says that there should be restrictions to prevent us from harming ourselves, not just other people. So the seatbelt law is a really good example of this. The government says we have to buckle up. If we are caught not wearing a seatbelt, then we can get a fine, which is a manner of restricting our freedom. Right? Um, there is a tangible consequence to us not following that rule. And the reason we have that rule is in order to protect ourselves. So this is something where if we don't buckle up, we aren't obviously harming another person. We're the ones who would suffer, right? Um, when we talk about paternalism, however, we are talking about restrictions on adults' behavior, because we still think that kids, um, we're a little bit more justified in regulating their behavior, and we should be able to tell them that you have to wear a helmet when you ride your bicycle, or there's age restrictions to being able to do certain things. But when we talk about paternalism, we're talking about adults. How are we justified in telling adults what they can or can't do when it comes to their own safety and their own body? So another example of, well, before we talk about some other examples, what is the justification for paternalism? So, you know, someone who doesn't agree with paternalism would say if someone wants to put themselves in danger, that's their business, right? Why should the government intervene? Why should the government step in and actually find that person or punish that person for doing something that should be within their right, right? If they want to take the risk, and if they want to die, or if they want to get hurt, um, and they're willing to take that risk, shouldn't that be up to them? Shouldn't they have the freedom to do that? Why is the government justified in stopping them? But there are some arguments on the other side. And what I would like you to do before I tell you what those arguments are is to think about what that could be. What could be the justification for paternalism? And as you're thinking about this, I want you to think about, like, what's the justification for a parent restricting their child's behavior, right? And how could that maybe be similar to the justification of a government restricting adult behavior in a society? So think about that question, answer that question, and then we will come back and continue this topic.